For 10,000 years, the Galactic Council had ruled with an iron grip, not through force of arms, but through bureaucracy so convoluted that even the most powerful civilizations found themselves ensnared in its endless web of policies and decrees. Their dominion spanned thousands of star systems, each bound by laws older than most species. The council chamber itself, a monolithic structure of obsidian and polished metal, floated in the dead center of the galaxy, suspended in the gravitational balance between 6 pulsars. It was a place of whispered deals, of slow-moving power struggles, where change was measured in centuries. The council was a construct of stagnation, a carefully curated system designed to ensure that no single species rose too high, that no civilization could disrupt the delicate balance of power. And at the very bottom of that hierarchy sat humanity. They had arrived late to the stars, emerging from the depths of their own conflicts, to find a galaxy already settled, already spoken for. When they first requested a seat at the table, the council granted it, mockingly, dismissively, as if handing a child a toy throne while the true rulers spoke behind closed doors. They were treated as an amusing anomaly, an unpredictable yet, ultimately insignificant species with no ancient lineage, no divine birthright to rule. While other young races spent centuries proving their worth through servitude and deference, humanity simply took what it needed. It was this very trait, this relentless, unyielding ambition, that made the old powers uneasy, but they tolerated humanity's presence, believing that, like all species before them, they would fall in line. The vast, tangled machinery of the council would wear them down, slow their progress, turn their aggression into another voice drowned out in the endless debates of the ruling elite. They were wrong. The war began, not with humanity, but with arrogance. It started at the edge of the Orion Arm, a dispute over a seemingly insignificant mining world between two of the Council's longest-standing members, the Zelani Dominion and the Valtari High Kin. Under normal circumstances, such matters would be resolved with drawn-out negotiations, agreements so layered in subtext and loopholes that they would take decades to finalize. But this time was different. A Valtari patrol fleet fired the first shots, annihilating a Zelani outpost that had dared to extract resources from what the Valtari considered their sovereign claim. The Zelani, a race that had once been proud warriors before centuries of political entanglement dulled their blades, responded with force. The Council attempted to intervene, to impose its will as it had done for millennia. But no one was listening. The Valtari would not back down. The Zelani refused to concede. What began as a localized conflict ignited into something far greater. Alliances were called upon, fleets mobilized. Old grudges, buried for centuries, flared to the surface. It was supposed to be contained. It wasn't. The war spread like wildfire, drawing in more species, more factions, until the entire galaxy was engulfed in chaos. The Council's laws, once the foundation of civilization, became meaningless. Treaties that had once dictated peace between empires were discarded as soon as the first battleships opened fire. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy knew true, uncontrolled war. And the Council failed. It had spent millennia ensuring that no single power could dominate. In doing so, it had crippled the development of military strength across the stars. No empire had been allowed to grow too powerful. No fleet had been permitted to outmatch another. Now, when war came, there was no one strong enough to win it. The great fleets of the past were relics. The once feared warrior clans had been reduced to ceremonial guards. The Council's own enforcers, the so-called arbiters of order, found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately irrelevant. Planets that had been ruled by law for millennia burned. The Valtari homeworld was reduced to glass in a single night. The Zelani war clans shattered, their once proud civilization splintered into warring factions. Trade collapsed. Star lanes once teeming with commerce became battlefields or graveyards. The Council itself fractured. Betrayals ran rampant. Assassinations became routine. Delegates fled, abandoning their duties, seeking shelter on distant worlds that would soon fall into chaos themselves. High Nexus Station, once the nerve center of galactic civilization, became a hollow ruin. The war did not end with a victor. It simply burned itself out. What remained was ruin. The empires that had stood for millennia were gone. Their banners, their laws, their very identities were little more than ash drifting through the void. The galaxy had entered a new dark age. Pirates roamed unchecked, preying on the weak. Warlords carved out their own petty dominions from the remains of fallen empires. Entire sectors went silent, their populations wiped out or enslaved. The galaxy had known chaos before. It had seen war, famine, even extinction events. But never had it seen this. Never had it been so leaderless, so utterly lost. And yet, amid the ruin, one species remained standing. Humanity. They had never relied on the Council. They had never bowed to its decrees, never waited for permission. While the great empires had wasted centuries in political stagnation, humanity had been forced to learn a different lesson: how to survive. When the war came, they did not hesitate. They adapted. They acted. They secured trade routes that the Council had abandoned. They protected colonies that had been left to die. They moved quickly, decisively, never waiting for permission, never asking for recognition. At first, no one noticed, but as the dust settled, a realization began to spread, whispered among the survivors, spoken aloud in the ruins of once great halls of power. The old rulers were gone. The galaxy was leaderless. And yet, where the Council had failed, humanity had succeeded. For the first time in history, the question was not whether humans deserved power. The question was whether there was anyone left who could stop them from taking it. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy was without rulers. The old empires, once symbols of strength and stability, had been reduced to memories. Some had been shattered in war, others had collapsed under the weight of their own corruption, and a few had simply faded into irrelevance. The Galactic Council, once the supreme authority over thousands of civilizations, was nothing more than a gutted shell. The High Nexus Station, the seat of its power, now drifted lifeless between pulsars, its once bustling halls silent. The great bureaucracies that had ruled entire star clusters were abandoned, their countless regulations and decrees now meaningless, relics of a bygone era. The galaxy had fallen into anarchy. Planets once governed by the Council's mandates now answered only to the strongest force that remained. Some worlds fell under the rule of warlords who had risen from the chaos, men and women who seized power through violence and fear. Others succumbed to the terror of pirate fleets, who descended upon defenseless colonies like carrion birds picking at a rotting corpse. Millions perished in the lawless void. Trade networks collapsed. Entire species, once thriving under the protection of interstellar commerce, faced starvation and extinction as supply lines were cut and resources dwindled. The infrastructure that had once connected the stars, hyper-relays, slipstream gates, and wormhole stabilizers, fell into disrepair or were seized by opportunistic factions. Those who still lived, who had not yet been consumed by war or despair, asked a single question: who would take the throne? Who would restore order to the chaos? No empire remained strong enough to claim it. The Zilani Dominion, once a mighty power, had fractured into warring factions. The Valtari High Kin, whose pride had driven them to war, had been eradicated. The Ishari Consortium, once masters of trade and diplomacy, had collapsed when their banking networks failed, their wealth rendered worthless in a galaxy ruled by the barrel of a gun. The void of leadership was absolute. And yet, there was one force that had not fallen: humanity. They had not emerged from the war unscathed. They had fought, bled, and suffered losses that could never be undone. They had lost entire fleets, seen colonies burn, watched as worlds they had sworn to protect were consumed by the fire of war. But they had survived. More than that, they had adapted. Unlike the old powers, humanity had never relied on the Council's decrees to dictate their actions. They had not built their civilization on the illusion of eternal peace or the complacency of a stagnant bureaucracy. When the war began, they had been underestimated. Their fleets, though smaller than those of the ancient empires, had been battle-hardened, forged in centuries of conflict. Their soldiers, though lacking the genetic enhancements or cybernetic augmentations of other species, had been relentless, driven not by programmed loyalty, but by something far more powerful: purpose. While the Council's fleets had been bound, by rules of engagement, humanity had fought without hesitation. Where other species hesitated, debating laws and consequences, humanity had acted. When star lanes became lawless and trade collapsed, human ships kept moving. When colonies cried, out for protection, it was human fleets that answered. At first, no one noticed. In the chaos of war, in the ruins of fallen civilizations, humanity's rise was subtle. They did not seize power with declarations of conquest or grand proclamations. They simply did what needed to be done. They rebuilt where others abandoned. They protected where others exploited. They enforced order where none remained. And so, without ever declaring their intention, they became the de facto rulers of the shattered galaxy. The survivors of the old empires saw it first. A Zilani war chief, leading what remained of his people, realized that his fleet could not survive on its own. He sought refuge in human-controlled space, expecting rejection, perhaps even annihilation. Instead, he was given sanctuary. His warriors were offered supplies, repairs, and even integration into human battle groups. A Valtari colony, stranded in the ruins of their fallen empire, braced for the arrival of human warships, believing they would be enslaved or eradicated in retaliation for the war. Instead, they were given food, medicine, and protection. A human governor was assigned, not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing force, ensuring that their people did not fall into the hands of slavers and warlords. It happened again, and again, one by one, remnants of the old galaxy turned to humanity, not out of loyalty, not out of love, but out of necessity. They had no other choice. Even those who had once mocked humanity, who had dismissed them as upstarts, now sought their aid, not because they wanted to, but because there was no alternative. The great throne of the galaxy, left vacant by the war, was never officially claimed. There was no grand coronation, no moment where humanity declared itself the new rulers of the stars. There was simply reality, the reality that when the war ended, when the last embers of the old order faded into darkness, humanity was the only power left standing. The throne had not been taken. The galaxy had simply placed it in their hands. The shift was not immediate. It did not happen in a single moment, nor was it marked by a declaration or ceremony. No banners were raised, no anthems were sung. And yet, with every passing cycle, the truth became undeniable. Humanity had not seized the throne. The galaxy had given it to them. At first, there was hesitation. The surviving factions of the old empires, the remnants of species who had once ruled vast sectors, refused to acknowledge it. Even in their desperation, even as they relied on human trade routes and human-enforced stability, they clung to the illusion that this was temporary. A Zilani warlord, once a general in the Dominions, great fleets sneered at the idea. Humanity, ruling the stars? The very thought was laughable. They had been the last to join the galactic stage, the least of the great powers. How could they now stand above all others? And yet, his warband found itself relying on human supply lines. His wounded were treated by human medics, his ships refueled, at human-controlled stations. The day he realized that his forces would not survive without them was the day his defiance began to fade. The Valtari, proud and arrogant even in their ruin, resisted even harder. Their high kin had fallen, their fleets shattered, but their pride remained. They would not bow to humans, would not recognize them as the new rulers of the void. They spoke of reclaiming their former glory, of rebuilding their empire. But words did not rebuild starships. Pride did not put food on starving worlds. When the last of their military governors abandoned them, when their systems teetered on the edge of total collapse, they too turned to humanity, not as equals, but as dependents. They called it a temporary arrangement, a necessity of the times, but they knew the truth. The galaxy belonged to humanity now, not because they had conquered it, not because they had demanded it, but because when the old powers fell, they were the only ones who could hold the stars together. The first signs of true authority came subtly. The great hyperlanes, once chaotic and lawless, became organized once more, not by decree, but by action. Human patrols moved through the void, escorting trade convoys, hunting down pirate fleets. It was not out of conquest, It was necessity. A Zelani merchant, once a citizen of a mighty dominion, found his ships being taxed at a human checkpoint. His first instinct was to resist, to demand that he not be subject to their authority. But then he realized there was no other authority left. The taxes were fair. The security was real. His ships had not been attacked in months, not since human patrols had taken control of the region. It was, he admitted bitterly, better than what the Dominion had given him. In its final years, across the galaxy, fractured worlds found themselves answering to a new power. A failing colony on the edges of known space, once abandoned by its own empire, found human engineers repairing its power grids, restoring its water systems. They did not ask for permission. They simply acted. A station orbiting a dying star, once a neutral trading hub, realized that its airlocks and docking procedures now followed human regulations. Not because they had been imposed, but because they worked. Because no one else had created a better system. It was a slow, creeping inevitability. Laws were enforced, not by decree, but by action. Infrastructure was rebuilt, not under a banner, but out of necessity. Worlds answered to humanity, not out of conquest, but because there was no one else to answer to. The last holdouts, the stubborn remnants of old governments, watched in growing horror as the reality set in. The Galactic Council had been a system of bureaucracy, its rule enforced by endless debates and diplomatic maneuvering. Humanity ruled differently. They did not waste time with proclamations. They did not beg for recognition. They did not care whether or not the old powers acknowledged them. They simply acted. The turning point came in the form of a crisis. A rogue warlord, one of the many scavengers who had risen in the aftermath of the war, declared himself the rightful ruler of the void. His fleet, made up of salvaged Dominion battleships and repurposed Valtari cruisers, descended upon a helpless sector. For decades, under the rule of the old Galactic Council, such an attack would have been met with endless deliberations. Petitions for aid would have been sent, debated, and eventually ignored. A fleet might have been dispatched, too late to make a difference. Humanity's response was different. There was no debate, no hesitation. Within hours of the attack, human warships arrived in force. The warlord's fleet, expecting a slow and measured counterattack, was instead met with overwhelming precision. Human ships did not fight with the careful posturing of the old empires. They fought to win. The battle was over in a single day. The warlord's flagship, a towering relic of the Old Dominion, was shattered in an instant. His fleet, unprepared for the brutal efficiency of human tactics, was destroyed with surgical precision. And when it was over, when the wreckage of his fleet drifted silently through the void, the survivors of the sector looked up at their new rulers and did not resist. The old empires had ruled through politics, through slow, deliberate processes that had crumbled when tested. Humanity ruled through action. The realization spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, those who had once resisted saw the truth. The throne was not empty. It had been filled, not by conquest, not by force, but by the simple reality that humanity was the only force strong enough, stable enough, and determined enough to hold the galaxy together. The war was over. The chaos was ending, and the age of humanity had begun. It began as whispers, not in the grand halls of what remained of the Galactic Council, nor in the chambers of defeated rulers, but in the streets, the marketplaces, and the war-torn colonies clinging to survival. The humans are in control now. It was not a declaration. It was not a prophecy. It was simply the truth. No banners had been raised. No ceremony had been held. There had been no speeches, no coronation, no grand proclamation of authority. And yet, with each passing cycle, humanity's grip on the shattered remains of the galactic order tightened, not by force, not through conquest, but through sheer necessity. The old systems had crumbled. The dominions that once held the stars in their grasp had splintered, their rulers either dead, exiled, or clinging desperately to the ruins of their former glory. The bureaucracies that had once dictated the flow of interstellar trade were gone, their records lost, their regulations meaningless in a galaxy on the brink of anarchy. And so the weight of the throne, one that no species had ever truly claimed, fell upon humanity's shoulders. But ruling was not the same as winning. humanity, had fought for survival. They had crushed fleets, shattered empires, and outmaneuvered the finest tacticians of the known galaxy. But now came a different kind of war. One not fought with warships and battalions, but with laws, with diplomacy, with the endless demands of a galaxy in turmoil. The first true test came not from an enemy, but from an ally. The Zilani, once high-ranking officers in the Dominion's navy, had fought fiercely in the war's final days, desperately clinging to what remained of their influence. Now, with their fleets shattered and their power reduced to scattered remnants, they found themselves dependent on humanity for survival. But dependence did not mean obedience. On the border of human-controlled space, a Zilani admiral named Koresh had seized control of a fortified station, a former Dominion outpost now under human governance. He claimed it was a defensive measure, a necessary step to protect his people from the lawless bands of raiders that still roamed the void. Humanity, stretched thin and already burdened with countless crises, had a choice: negotiate or retaliate. Under the old Galactic Council, this would have resulted in weeks, if not months, of diplomatic back and forth. Delegations would have been sent, treaties would have been drafted, argued over, revised, and then ultimately ignored. Humanity did not have that luxury. Within hours of Koresh's seizure of the station, a fleet of human warships arrived. Their weapons remained cold, their formations tight. A single transmission was sent: "You have 1 hour to stand down." Koresh, a veteran of countless Dominion campaigns, scoffed at the ultimatum. The old powers would have folded. They would have bargained, hesitated, wavered in the face of confrontation. He had prepared for negotiations, for political maneuvering. What he had not prepared for was the sudden, surgical precision of humanity's response. Exactly 1 hour after the warning was issued, human boarding teams breached the station. They did not negotiate. They did not stall. They moved with practiced efficiency, disabling defenses, securing key systems, and within minutes, Koresh and his forces were in custody. There was no trial, no drawn-out political theater. Koresh was not executed, nor was he exiled. Instead, he was placed in front of a simple choice: swear allegiance to the new order, or be cast into the void. He chose the former. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity was not the old Galactic Council. They did not tolerate insubordination. They did not play games. Their rule was swift, decisive, and absolute. But not all resistance came in the form of defiance. On the fringes of human-controlled space, a delegation from the Valtari arrived, what remained of their noble houses, stripped of their fleets, their power reduced to nothing more than titles carried by refugees. They had once ruled entire sectors, their word law, their dominance unquestioned. Now they were beggars in a galaxy that had passed them by. They requested an audience with humanity's leadership. They expected the formality of the old ways, the grand chambers, the endless posturing of diplomats, the delicate maneuvering of interstellar politics. Instead, they were met by a single human representative in a modest, functional war room. There were no ornate decorations, no displays of grandeur, just cold steel walls and a holographic map of the galaxy, one that was no longer divided by the lines of the old empires, but by the steady, growing influence of humanity. "State your case," the human envoy said, wasting no time. The Valtari, once a species of unparalleled arrogance, found themselves speaking not as rulers, but as survivors. They pleaded for a place in the new order, for recognition, for some fragment of their former status to remain. The response they received was blunt: "If you wish to be part of this galaxy, you will work for it." There were no special privileges, no preferential treatment. The Valtari, once the self-proclaimed lords of the stars, were given a choice: adapt, contribute, or fade into irrelevance. Some refused. They clung to the past, retreating to hidden enclaves, whispering of lost glory and the dream of reclaiming their throne. But most saw the truth. The galaxy did not belong to them anymore. It belonged to those who could keep it from falling apart. Humanity had not asked for this power. They had not sought to rule. But the weight of the throne had fallen upon them, and they carried it not with arrogance, but with the simple, unshakable determination that had always defined them: And so, the new order began, not with fanfare, not with celebration, but with the quiet, relentless march of a species that refused to let the stars fall into darkness. The galaxy was vast, its wounds deeper than any could measure. Even as the embers of war cooled, they left behind ruins, worlds, stripped bare by orbital bombardment, entire sectors lawless and fractured, desperate populations clinging to survival. It was one thing to seize power, it was another to wield it. Humanity had shattered the Dominion, had scattered the old powers into the shadows, but their true trial had only begun. The throne did not care for conquest. The throne demanded order, and so, humanity moved, not as conquerors, but as the architects of a galaxy teetering on the edge of oblivion. It started with the trade lanes. For centuries, interstellar commerce had been the lifeblood of civilization, flowing between worlds like an intricate web. The war had ripped that web apart. Key relay stations were gone, automated shipping fleets lay in ruins, and the once thriving marketplaces of the core systems now stood silent. Entire species found themselves on the brink of famine, cut off from vital resources they could not produce on their own. Humanity's first decree was not one of military might, but of restoration. Old shipping routes were cleared, with human warships escorting convoys through lawless regions where pirates and warlords still preyed upon the weak. Former Dominion supply hubs were repurposed, not as monuments to humanity's victory, but as distribution centers, ensuring that food, medicine, and power reached those who needed it. There was no charity in this, only necessity. A starving, desperate galaxy was an unstable one, and humanity had no intention of ruling over chaos. But not all accepted this new order. The first true rebellion arose from the outer colonies, where former Dominion officers and aristocrats had fled. They called themselves the Remnant, a coalition of the old elite, vowing to reclaim the galaxy from the Terran usurpers. In secrecy, they amassed what little they had left, scavenged warships, hidden stockpiles of weapons, and mercenaries with nothing to lose. Their first strike came swiftly. In the void between stars, a critical refueling station was reduced to wreckage, its workers slaughtered, its reserves stolen. Within hours, communication hubs along the trade routes went dark, and distress signals echoed from dozens of systems. The Remnant believed they were launching the first blow in a war to reclaim their dominance. They did not understand what they had unleashed. Humanity had spent years fighting for survival. Against the Dominion, they had been forced to outmaneuver a technologically superior enemy, to adapt, to endure. The Remnant, by comparison, was a shadow of what had come before. The response was immediate. A fleet moved with surgical precision, not hunting the rebels, but cutting them off. Every system they relied upon, every supply depot, every hidden base, every staging ground, was erased before they could react. One by one, their stolen warships were intercepted, disabled, or destroyed before they ever had the chance to strike again. The final battle was not a battle at all. Trapped in a dying star system with no escape, the remnants of the Remnant gathered, torn between surrender and a final desperate stand. Their leaders sent messages to every former ally, pleading for aid. None came. Then, a single transmission from the human command ship. "This is over." Some fought to the bitter end, their warships burning in the void, refusing to accept the reality of their defeat. Others, those who still clung to survival over pride, laid down their arms. For those who surrendered, there was no mass execution, no displays of brutality, but there were no second chances. Every officer of the Old Dominion who had taken up arms against the new order was stripped of their rank, their titles, their privileges. Some were sent to work in the very systems they had tried to destabilize, under strict human oversight, rebuilding what they had once sought to destroy. The message was clear. The galaxy was not going back to the way it was. Those who could not accept that would be left behind. Even as the remnants of the old elite fell, new threats emerged, not from enemies, but from the burden of rule itself. The galaxy was not meant to be ruled by one power alone. No species had ever attempted it before. The Dominion had enforced order through fear and subjugation. The Galactic Council before them had maintained balance through endless bureaucracy and compromise. Humanity had chosen neither path. They did not govern as dictators, nor did they drown in indecision. Instead, they demanded participation. Every world that fell under their protection was given the same ultimatum: work with us, or be left to the void. Some resisted. They called humanity tyrants, invaders, a species too young and reckless to hold the throne. And yet, for all their outrage, they could not deny the reality before them. For the first time in known history, the chaos was fading. The lawless sectors where pirates once thrived were now patrolled by human fleets, ensuring safe passage for all who followed the new laws. Starving colonies that had suffered under the weight of war now found supply lines restored, their populations stabilizing. The old bureaucracies had collapsed, but in their place, something new was forming. A system where action took precedence, over debate, where those who contributed had a voice, and those who schemed for power alone found themselves cast aside. It was not a perfect order. It was not without its enemies. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy was not ruled by fear, nor by corruption. It was ruled by those who refused to let it fall, and humanity, burdened by the throne they never sought, carried its weight without faltering. The throne was not just a symbol. It was not merely a seat of power, nor a title to be claimed. It was a burden, one heavier than any battlefield, more treacherous than any war. Humanity had won the right to rule, but ruling was a war of a different kind. The galaxy had always been a fractured, seething mass of rivalries, grudges, and ancient hatreds buried beneath the illusion of order. The Dominion had crushed dissent through terror, wielding brutality as their only tool. Before them, the Galactic Council had suffocated progress with endless debate, choosing inaction over difficult decisions. Humanity could not afford either path. There was no peace in mere survival. The first challenge came from the ashes of the Dominion itself, not from the scattered warlords or the exiled elite, but from the former subjects, the billions who had known only oppression. To them, humanity was an unknown force, an anomaly in the galactic stage. Some saw them as saviors, the ones who had shattered the chains of their oppressors. Others saw them as yet another conqueror, wearing different armor but wielding the same authority. It did not take long for the fractures to show. On the industrial world of Mirren IV, once a slave world under Dominion rule, the moment the Dominion fell, chaos erupted. The former rulers had fled or been executed in the uprising. Now, the planet stood leaderless, split between factions. Former workers who wanted independence, local military forces who sought to carve out their own empire, and desperate survivors who had only ever known the rule of the strong. When the first human envoy arrived, they were met with suspicion. The people had seen empires rise and fall before. Every new ruler had promised order. Every new government had claimed to be different. And yet, in the end, the common people had always been the ones to suffer. The leader of the strongest faction, a hardened former laborer named Ralvek, stood before the human delegation and made their position clear. "We do not want another empire. We will not bow again." To that, the human commander only gave a simple answer: "Then don't." There was no demand for allegiance, no declaration of dominion. Instead, the humans asked only one question: "What do you need?" Not as rulers, but as those who had once risen from ruin themselves, humanity offered aid, not as a leash, but as a foundation. Medical supplies to stabilize the sick and wounded, infrastructure to restore power and clean water, engineers to rebuild what war had destroyed. But the lawlessness could not remain. For the first time in history, the decision was left to the people. The choice was theirs: govern themselves or descend into anarchy. And so, the first true test of humanity's rule was not through conquest, but through governance. Through something the Dominion had never allowed: choice. Not all worlds accepted it. Some rejected the new order outright. There were those who refused to believe in a future where they were not ruled by force. These systems attempted to isolate themselves, to hold on to the ways of the past. They closed their borders, turned away diplomats, and refused trade with the human-led sectors. At first, humanity let them struggle, let them see what their defiance would bring. One by one, the isolationists faltered, not because humanity attacked them, but because the galaxy itself had changed. The old networks were gone. The infrastructure that had sustained them no longer functioned. They found themselves cut off, abandoned by the very empires they had once relied upon. Then, as their worlds fell into hardship, the offers came again. Not as an ultimatum, but as a simple truth. Join us, and you will not stand alone. One by one, they yielded. Not by force, not by fear, but because humanity had offered something no empire before them ever had: a future. And yet, for all the struggles of governance, another storm was brewing. One that no fleet could fight, no army could conquer, no decree could prevent. The throne had made humanity the most powerful force in the galaxy, and now, those beyond the known stars had taken notice. The galaxy was vast. Even with the Dominion's collapse and the old Galactic Council gone, even with humanity at the center of it all, there were still shadows beyond the edge of known space. There were always shadows. For centuries the Dominion had ruled through brutality, but their iron fist had not reached everything. There were whispers, even in their time, of powers beyond the rim. Civilizations that had never bowed to the galactic order. Empires that had watched and waited, unseen. The Dominion had dismissed them as rumors. The Galactic Council had feared them but never dared to seek them out. Now, as humanity sat upon the throne, those shadows began to move. It started with silence. The frontier worlds, far-flung colonies and border stations that had barely survived Dominion rule, began to go dark. At first, the reports were scattered, unclear. Sensor stations failing, patrols not returning, merchant ships simply vanishing without a trace. Then came the distress calls. Broken, fragmented transmissions. No warnings, no demands. Only a single, chilling phrase repeated in desperate voices. They are here. And then, nothing. No wreckage. No survivors. Only emptiness where entire fleets had once been. Humanity had expected challenges after taking the throne. Rebellions. Political unrest. A struggle to maintain order. They had not expected. A meeting was called on Earth, in the heart of the new galactic capital. The leaders of the liberated worlds, the generals of the human fleet, and the surviving remnants of former Dominion races, all gathered in one room. For the first time, every species, every faction, every divided fragment of the galaxy sat at the same table. Not as conquerors and subjects, not as rulers and rebels, but as equals facing an unknown threat. "We do not know what they are," the admiral of the human fleet admitted, "but we know they are coming." The room was silent. For all of their victories, for all of their strength, humanity had never faced an enemy they could not understand. The Dominion had been cruel, but they had been predictable. The Galactic Council had been weak, but they had been known. This was something else. But if there was one thing humanity had learned through its long history, it was that fear alone could not decide the future. Preparations began. The fleets were reinforced, not as conquerors, but as guardians. Defensive lines were drawn along the frontier, stationing warships where no defenses had ever been placed before. Every ship, every station, every outpost was placed under constant surveillance. But the question remained: would it be enough? Then, the first true battle came. A single world, out on the edge of known space. A colony established after the Dominion's fall, newly settled, barely fortified. And yet, when the enemy arrived, there was no warning. No fleets emerging from hyperspace. No grand invasion, only darkness. The colony's sun, once a brilliant blue giant, dimmed as if something unseen had wrapped itself around the system, strangling its light. The transmissions from the surface became frantic. Shadows moved across the land, shapes with no form, creatures that did not appear on sensors but tore through walls as if they were paper. The fleet arrived too late. The planet was dead, not conquered, not bombarded from orbit, not burned, empty, as if the people had simply ceased to exist. For the first time, the leaders of the galaxy, human and alien alike, felt something deeper than fear: dread. And yet, even as the weight of this unknown horror settled upon them, even as fear threatened to take hold, humanity did what it always had. It adapted. It prepared. It did not bow to the inevitable. The throne had been taken, but it was not a prize. It was not the end of the war. It was only the beginning, and if something in the dark had come to challenge them, then humanity would do what it did best. It would survive, it would fight, and it would win. The story of humanity was never about a single moment, not about a single war, a single victory, or a single throne. It was about something far greater. It was about what came next, and the galaxy was about to find out.